Okay, I think we've gone live. This is Benjamin James Butler, futurist and founder of the Emerging Future Institute. I'm joined by the world-renowned author Fritjof Capra, who wrote Tao of Physics, The Web of Life. Joined by the world-renowned author back there. I'm joined by Fritjof Capra, author of the Tao of Physics, Web of Life, and more recently, the System View of Life, and Simon Robinson down in Brazil, author of Holonomics and a consultant down there. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, greetings from Berkeley.
Hi, Benjamin. Greetings from Brazil too.
Wrote Tao of Physics, the Web of Life. I've got a little bit of feedback on my line, so hopefully it's going to work. If I'll check the I'm joined by the chat comments on YouTube. So if people can't hear very clearly, please indicate, and I'll check those shortly.
Is that what's causing the feedback, Benjamin?
Author of Holonomics.
Yeah, I hear the feedback too.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, greetings from Berkeley.
Hi, Benjamin. Greetings from Brazil too.
Great. I've got a little bit of feedback on my line, so hopefully it's going to work. If I'll check the chat comments on YouTube. So if people can't hear very clearly, please indicate, and I'll check those shortly.
Is that what's causing the feedback, Benjamin?
I'm not sure what's actually causing the feedback. Can we just make sure that can we just make sure, Simon and Fritjof, that you've switched off the YouTube?
Yes, I don't have any other browser open at all.
Let me see. The Skype. Yeah, my Skype is closed.
Okay, how is that now? What wonderful! I think we've lost the feedback loop.
That's great.
Okay,
it's good for me.
Great. Well, we've got a few more people joining us, so apologies for the technologically challenged start. I want to just thank everyone around the world for joining us, and I know we have a Brazilian contingent joining us, so I want to send a special obrigada to all the Brazilians that are watching this conversation. So today, this is really about our planetary journey, planetary transformation. So I'd like to kick off with a sort of the 40,000 foot view of where we are, and then we'll go into into more details on the currents and cross currents of what's perhaps going on. Stephen Hawking in The Guardian this week wrote a column saying that this is the most dangerous time for our planet. So I'd like to start off with Fritjof. Where do you think we are on this journey, and are you optimistic?
Well, I think we are indeed in the midst of a planetary crisis. By the way, Noam Chomsky just said the same on the American program Democracy Now!, very much like Stephen Hawking. So we are in a planetary crisis, which I identified as essentially a crisis of perception already 30 years ago. Since then, the crisis has become more acute. Just think of global climate change and economic inequality, the two most pressing issues, which I'm sure we'll get into. At the same time, there's much greater awareness of the crisis, and there are actually effective solutions to all the major problems of our time. solutions that have been developed and tested all over the world. And this is why I'm hopeful.
So, Simon, what's your perspective down there in Brazil?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Fritjof said about the crisis of perception, because, you know, I'm British, but I'm in Brazil, and I have not an outsider's, but I have a very distant perspective on things like Brexit and the American elections. And at times it does seem that the world is becoming much more polarized with opinions. But I feel a great responsibility when we use words such as crisis, because a crisis can be seen as an opportunity for change and transition. So absolutely, there are some fascinating things happening at the society level in Brazil. And this is what I would really say. I think we are in a crisis, but the world's leaders, we desperately need leaders who can really help people see the opportunities and where we need to move now.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I mean, I describe this period as a kind of a great paradox. You know, things getting better and getting worse at the same time, at perhaps an accelerating pace. You know, I think we're at a time of huge transformation. And sometimes it's darkest before the dawn. One of my influences on my life was a Zen monk called Sun San, and he always said that a good situation is a bad situation, and a bad situation is a good situation. So really, like you say, Simon, the opportunity in crisis. You know, I take a very cyclical look at history, which is not necessarily taught at school. I think a lot of the indigenous people around the world have this view. They know this in the Himalayas. You know, I've been up to Dharamsala. They know this in the Korean mountains, and I think the American natives know this as well. I think actually quite a lot of smart economists and investors know this. I think Kondratiev, the guy that came up with the cycles, got actually shot for perhaps knowing this. But history is cyclical. If you want a sort of a modern day account of that, there's a book by Howe called The Great Turning. I think we're actually on track in a way, and I'm hoping that we'll be out of the financial and social crisis by 2025.
Yeah. I think, Benjamin, speaking of indigenous cultures, we should give a shout out to the tribes at Standing Rock, who are demonstrating an amazing power of vision and of spirituality at this very moment.
And I think, they've really, this is a story that has achieved global coverage. And, you know, it's fascinating to see some of the American people joining them. I think that's a great example, Fritjof.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we need them more than ever. But before we delve into the sort of different currents and cross currents, I just wanted to ask a more personal question of you both. How was it that you came to see the world in a more holistic or systemic way? And perhaps I'd start with you, Fritjof.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Let me think. I think for me, it all started when I read Werner Heisenberg's Physics and Philosophy as a young student. In this book, which has now become a classic, Heisenberg describes very vividly the conceptual problems faced by the people who developed quantum physics, a handful of physicists in Europe, and describes very vividly the shift from seeing the material world as a machine made up of isolated parts to an inseparable network of relationships. One passage of this book stands out in my memory, and that's about the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Heisenberg wrote, "The Cartesian partition has penetrated deeply into the human mind during the 3 centuries following Descartes, and it will take a long time for it to be replaced by a really different understanding of the nature of reality." I'm quoting from memory here, but it's something like that. Now, looking back to that time, I can now see that this statement and Heisenberg's book as a whole determined the trajectory of my entire career as a scientist and a writer. For the past 30 or 40 years, I have investigated the paradigm shift from a mechanistic to a holistic and ecological worldview and everything that is associated with it. And it all goes back to that one book by Werner Heisenberg.
Fritjof, where were you when you read that book, just out of interest?
Well, I was in Innsbruck. I was a young student. This was the late 50s. And I bought the book a couple of years after it came out. I still have the old worn paperback edition. And, I understood not more than half of it when I was a young student, but it accompanied me throughout my life and really determined my work.
Wow. So you've been at this for a while then?
For a long time, yes.
Well, no, it's great to have your insights today. So Simon, what about yourself?
Yeah, it's interesting. With my background in my 20s, I had a very enjoyable career in technology and innovation. And of course, the key skills there are both analysis and synthesis. But it would have actually been 2009. The first book from Fritjof that I read was, in fact, The Web of Life. And of course, this was a completely different type of synthesis, uniting, both mind and matter. And this was also very revolutionary for me, having studied cognitive psychology at university, which is, of course, very reductionist. But in terms of wholeness, I think the person who had the greatest impact on me was Henry Borthoft, who was also a physicist and philosopher. And what Henry did with his work on the wholeness of nature, he taught me to really understand that philosophy is less about the discussion of opinions and more about the way of seeing. And Fritjof really talks about that. So what Henry helped me to really understand is Fritjof's systemic view of life at a much deeper level. Because with the systems view of life, we talk about autopoiesis and concepts such as this, and you can't quite grasp all of the theory just in a purely intellectual manner. And so it was Henry Borthoft's way of talking about the dynamic understanding of wholeness that really kind of brought the systems view of life for me.
I guess I would say from a young age I was a fairly holistic thinker, although I had no idea about complexity theory and all of this. I think the backstory was, this is just my theory, when I was young, the government told parents in the 70s to give children fluoride tablets to strengthen their teeth, and I swear it caused me some brain damage or something. But I struggled. I had certain learning difficulties early on at school, and I think I made up for it with a sort of I kind of compensated with an enhanced level of intuition and ability to see patterns. So when I figured that out, I went from bottom of my class to the top, and then I ended up in the financial sector, where I had some very good mentors early on that taught me to look at the world in a interdisciplinary, interconnected way, and I spent a lot of time looking at patterns and trends. And then it was later in life when I discovered Zen. I was brought to Zen because I started to see a lack of meaning in my career. And in Zen, they say the entire universe, you can see the entire universe in a tree. The clouds, the ocean, the water, the sunlight, the sunlight's energy, the nutrients of the soil, and even stardust. That's kind of the way I kind of shifted my seeing. Whilst not as romantic, you might also say that you can see the entire universe in a stock price as well.
Yeah. Well, Benjamin, we have something in common there, because in addition to Heisenberg, later on in the 60s, I was also very influenced by the writings of Alan Watts, and later on by the classic writings of Eastern spiritual traditions. But Alan Watts, in his book, The Way of Zen, really brought back to me the same kind of perception that I also got from Werner Heisenberg. And so it was at that moment that I put the two together, which then resulted much later in my first book, The Tao of Physics.
Yeah, no, I spoke to a friend just this week that was reading your Tao of Physics and was excited to be joining us today.
All right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just going to say the last phase of my life really actually led me to your work, Fritjof, and I struggled with some of the chaos theory and complexity theory books, and you so eloquently laid it out. I was then able to go back and read them. So thank you.
Wonderful.
So I was going to, unless either of you have anything else to say, I was going to move on to the environment.
Sure. Sounds like a good topic.
Yeah. So, a year, we put an article out on the anniversary of COP21 recently. DiCaprio's film just came out. Donald Trump's obviously been making headlines on the environment as well. So I just like to ask both of you where you think we are now. Perhaps Simon, you want to start?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Leonardo DiCaprio, because this week I finally got round to watching his blockbuster, The Revenant. And that really, although of course there are some violent scenes in there, it really brought home to me the fact that maybe how much more distance there is now between us and the raw natural world, compared to those pioneering days. So I think DiCaprio gives us a really amazing performance of someone who really shows just how dependable we are on nature, because we are nature and everything is interrelated. And also, just as we're seeing people respond to potential ecological disasters in the United States, of course, here in Brazil, we had a huge tragedy with the Fundão Dam that broke, destroying the River Doce. And this was a huge disaster, but it's, again, what I see is people reacting, responding, still remembering these disasters. And so, as well as having these disasters, I think we should mention that I've actually seen many different businesses now discuss the United Nations sustainability goals. So while there are disasters, I really think that just the sheer volume of conversations that have been growing last year and this year, it is very, very encouraging. And this kind of people-led reaction is now causing some companies to respond to, these changing consumer attitudes. Although, of course, we do have to still watch out for greenwashing and hold companies to account.
Yeah, I agree with you, Simon, that we are just about at a cusp now. And that's, of course, the defining characteristic of a crisis. The Paris Agreement on climate change, which entered into force last month, certainly can give us hope. Just think that the Kyoto Protocol took 8 years to be ratified. The Paris Agreement took just 11 months. It's a huge difference. So there's indeed much more awareness. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to hold global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's the number that climate scientists tell us we have to reach to stay safe. But the actual actions around the world are still woefully slow. So in Paris, the nations agreed to aim at this goal, but then, of course, the critical thing is, what do they do? And while actions are still very slow, the impacts of global warming are now happening much faster than scientists had originally predicted. So the urgency to act is extreme. I think that's something we can agree on.
Thank you, Fritjof. Yeah, I agree. It was a real Herculean task to get everyone together for Paris. With DiCaprio's film, I thought it was interesting, but I do think it highlighted a few contradictions in our society. A number of people I spoke to said, why didn't he explore his own internal dialogue and challenges a little bit more? Surely this Hollywood celebrities kind of living the lavish lifestyle, flying around, presumably on private jets. Is he really just telling the rest of us to live in boxes and consume less? Does it epitomize the views of the elites? Are we not, are we not in this together? But zooming out, I think it's the environmental challenges need to be approached in a holistic way. I think focusing only on carbon and global warming is a bit of an oversimplification. We hear about the collapse in biodiversity as equally, if not more serious. And I don't think negative campaigning is effective. This big guilt trip doesn't. I was talking to someone that was in marketing at Greenpeace before, and he agreed with really the way forward is to cultivate our connection to Earth, as opposed to negative campaigning. So
and also, Benjamin, the fact that, as you said, none of these problems can be solved in isolation. They're all interconnected and interdependent. Yeah. They're all systemic problems. And this is why we need systemic thinking in terms of patterns, in terms of relationships, in terms of context. That's one of my main messages.
I think the other interesting message that you share, Fritjof, that I really like is the fact that values are an absolutely fundamental part of systems thinking. And this is absolutely true when it comes to things like the Paris Agreement. Could you just mention a little bit about values, Fritjof? Because I think this sometimes is a message that may get a little bit lost, but I think it's one of the most important aspects, one of the most important things you say, for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole systems view of life, the whole paradigm shift is not just a shift in concepts, but also very substantially a shift in values. Actually, a paradigm is defined as a set of concepts, values, and practices that make up a particular vision of a particular culture. So values definitely are at the very core. And I hope that in the rest of the conversation, we can come back to values with concrete examples.
Yeah, we'll talk about values. I actually, Fritjof, I was going to talk about, as this, on the environment, I think that it's wonderful that consciousness sort of towards the environment is rising. How significant do you think it was for people like James Lovelock to come along and coin Gaia theory and sort of give I guess, like your good self, give scientific underpinning to a different way of looking at Earth?
Well, this has been part of a whole emerging new vision of reality, and especially a new vision of life. At the forefront of science, we've come to realize that the material world is not a machine made of isolated fundamental elements or basic building blocks, but rather is an inseparable network of relationships. What I mentioned before in connection with Werner Heisenberg is now happening all over the sciences. And what Lovelock and Lynn Margulis brought to that was the same view at the largest level that we can deal with scientifically on Earth, namely the planet as a whole. We have realized the planet as a whole is a self-regulating, self-organizing system. We have also realized that evolution is not a competitive struggle for existence, as the neo-Darwinists would have it, but rather is a cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And now you both have mentioned complexity and chaos theory. With this emphasis on complexity, on networks, on patterns of organization, a whole new science of qualities is now slowly emerging. And this is what I call the systems view of life.
I think it's amazing when I was at school and I guess when I studied economics at university, if you couldn't put a number on it, it really wasn't taken seriously. And I guess we're shifting away from just quantities to qualities as well.
That's right. And we are shifting from measuring to mapping. A quality cannot be measured quantitatively, but it can be mapped as a set of relationships.
Mm. Well, fascinating stuff. I was going to move on now to where we are in society globally. A lot of events have happened this year, from Brexit to US presidential election, changes in Brazil. I'm here in Korea, and 2 million people or so were on the streets protesting last weekend, and yesterday the president was impeached, or at least the impeachment process is going to start. Simon, what's happening in your side of the world, and how do you see the world?
Yeah, again, it's an absolutely fascinating time to be here in Brazil, because I'm really getting the full, complex, nuanced view of what's happening here politically, rather than the kind of summaries you get in the international and especially the English-speaking press. And I really think Brazil is absolutely leading the way in saying no to political corruption, no to commercial corruption, and some very, very, very powerful and wealthy individuals are now in prison, whereas even 5 years ago, this would be absolutely unthinkable. Now, the other thing that we experienced in Brazil recently was the great tragedy with the football team Chapecoense and the tragic plane crash. But again, what really hit me was this outpouring of compassion and humanity all around the world. And we saw football teams having a minute's silence. in England, football stadiums where you could hear a pin drop, every single person was silent. And really, for me, this is, people all around the world showing politicians and the elites, as Stephen Hawking mentioned, what living your values really is. And so, we are experiencing tragedies, but people really are expressing unity. And sometimes things like this really do can bring people together, as opposed to, say, the political situations, which can be very, very divisive. And of course, we know that often behind the scenes, there are deliberate attempts to, divide and conquer people. But something like this tragedy, it really showed just how much we really are interlinked around the world, not intellectually, not just on social media, but through feeling as well, and through heart and soul.
Yeah, and I think I have to mention this again, a similar very moving series of events happened here in the Dakotas with Standing Rock and this huge encampment in bitter cold winter where thousands of people joined it, also from all over the world and spontaneously. So this outpouring of humanity is something that we have as a human family, and I think that's a very hopeful sign. Well, let me talk a little bit about another issue. We talked about climate change a little bit. Next to climate change, I think economic inequality is our most urgent global problem. The gap between the rich and the poor has grown significantly, both internationally and within countries. Among advanced industrial countries, the United States has by far the highest level of inequality. This was brought about, for one, by the rise of global capitalism, also known as economic globalization, but also by specific government policies in favor of the 1% rather than the 99%, to borrow the phrase used and popularized by the Occupy movement. So tax cuts and other favorable economic conditions for the rich are being implemented at expense of social services, education, healthcare, and so on for everybody else. Now, why is this possible? It is possible because we live in an oligarchy rather than a democracy, where most politicians are utterly corrupt. I come back to what you mentioned before, Simon. So you see, this is how the problems of climate change, economic inequality, healthcare, education, and ethics are all interconnected. They're all systemic problems. Corruption, of course, is first and foremost a problem of ethics. Now, the two recent shocking elections, the referendum on Brexit in the UK and the US presidential election, were to a large extent protest votes by frustrated citizens who are suffering under the effects of neoliberal policies of deregulation, privatization, austerity, and corporate trade. They voted against the political and financial elites, both in the UK and in the US. And they voted for alternatives they were told would come to their rescue. Independence from Brussels in the case of Brexit, and populist policies promised by Donald Trump. Now, the tragedy is that these promises were false on both sides of the Atlantic. It is already becoming clear that the poor in the UK will suffer most from Brexit. And in the meantime, President-elect Trump is filling his cabinet with billionaires and Wall Street insiders who plan to make economic inequality much worse. So it'll get much worse before it can get better.
Yeah, Fritjof, it's funny you say the US has moved from a democracy to an oligarchy. I think,
absolutely.
Was it Princeton in the last couple of years had a survey, and that they no longer defined, or the authors of that particular survey no longer defined the United States as a democracy. I thought that was
I think they're right.
I mean, we got a bit of attention for predicting some of these events this year. The Brexit, the Trump victory, and then like a week ago, the Italians had a referendum. And again,
maybe Benjamin, excuse me for interrupting. I should speak up for Austria here, my home country, because in Austria there was a presidential election, and the president there is a purely, functional job like in Germany and in Italy. But it was a little bit of an election of two candidates that were a little similar to Trump and Bernie Sanders. If Trump and Bernie Sanders had run against each other, that would have been the scenario. And it was a right-wing neo-Nazi politician running against a green academic, and the green academic won. It was a very long and complex story, but now Austria has a green president. And when you look at the electoral map, it's very interesting that it's very similar to the Brexit map, that people in cities voted largely for the Green candidate, and people in the country who felt neglected voted for the right-wing candidate. In Austria, fortunately, the population in cities had the majority, and so now we have a Green president.
Mm.
And maybe we should also mention the people of Iceland as well, who are really trying to tackle financial corruption. I think that's quite an inspiring, we need to remember them as well, as compared to what happens with bankers in the UK.
And especially the women of Iceland, because Iceland is a country where women are really equal in politics. And some time ago, actually it was in one of the last films of Michael Moore, he interviewed an Icelandic politician, and she said, a former president of Iceland, and she said, at the beginning, when we had a few women, nothing much changed. But once women got up to 50%, things changed dramatically. And this is why they stood up against the banks and corruption and various other things.
Yeah, and it's some great inspiration for other democracies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating what's going on there. I mean, I described at least Brexit and Trump, the phenomenon, as the Hunger Games revolutions. When I watched that dystopian film about the Hunger Games, you had this rich capital, and they were the technological elite, and they kind of looked down at all the denizens of districts 1 to 12. And if you haven't seen the film, you really should. And taking a holistic view, like Fritjof said, I went out into districts 1 to 12 and spoke to a lot of people, and it was becoming very obvious that there was a lot of pain and suffering there. So I think one other point, aside from globalization, which might not be internationalization. Some people think globalization actually it isn't necessarily capitalism. It's benefited a small group of very large corporations. So there is a difference, but central bank policy has made the wealth disparities much larger in the last few years. So it's kind of backfired. I mean, my concern about all of this is that if you took a whole group of Democrats and Republicans and you put them in a room together, there's an incredible number of things they would agree on, but no one's talking. And there's a wonderful book, The Great Turn-In by, forgotten the gentleman's name, Joanna Macy talks about it as well, but there's another gentleman in Seattle, and he dedicates quite a few pages to his books on what values Americans actually agree upon.
Yeah, that's David Corton.
Yeah, that's right.
David Corton.
Yeah.
Fritjof, I know you were quite a supporter of Bernie Sanders. I was wondering, just from your perspective, is Bernie Sanders going to be able to at least have some kind of positive impact on a Trump government in some way, some influence?
Well, I think, first of all, I like your pronunciation, Bernie Sanders, because
oh, sorry.
Here is called Bernie Sanders, but
oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
It's all right. It's very nice. Now, I think I can link this to what Benjamin just said before about surprising agreements. When you look at opinion polls that were taken, maybe a year or two ago, you see that Americans overwhelmingly agree on a wide range of issues. They want policies to make the economy more fair and hold corporate executives accountable. They want stronger environmental and consumer protections. They want to fix our political system so that it serves the interest of all, not just the very rich. And these aren't even close issues in these opinion polls. There is a widespread agreement, vast majorities for these values and issues. And those are exactly the issues that Bernie Sanders was fighting for. And this is why he had such a huge success beyond all expectations. Now, the problem is not that Americans don't agree. The problem is the corporate power structure does not agree with these values. And so what did it do? Well, it blocked out Bernie when they saw that he had this tremendous influx of followers and these tremendously huge rallies. They were just not reported. They ignored him completely until it was too late for Bernie and he didn't make it. But had it been reported fairly, I think he would have won the election. Instead of reporting on Bernie's rallies, the mass media, the corporate media, reported on Trump. And Trump didn't offer any issues. He just offered his insults and his histrionics, but it was excellent entertainment for television and, for the corporate power structure. So now that the election is run, Bernie is continuing the movement. He calls it Our Revolution. And it will be a very rigorous opposition to the Trump administration. I don't think he's interested in negotiating right now. He will work with Trump, but he said the problem is not what are we going to do for him. The problem is what can he do for us? Will he come to us and talk to us about these issues? So it's going to be an interesting time.
Yeah, well, it is a fascinating time. I think Stephen Hawking was right this week, where he basically suggested dialogue and a little bit of humility from the elites, because I think Brexit, particularly, I felt it being British, but I felt I'd been out and spoken to a lot of people outside London, and I understood their pain and suffering to a certain degree. And the day after, or the days after Brexit, they were all being branded as racist and this and that. And I don't think the media is helping bring people together. I think they're exacerbating the problem, as is social media, which has become sort of a echo chambers. Mm-hmm. And one thing I like to remind myself is actually the real revolution needs to come from us. This kind of messiah complex that people have, that if Obama becomes president, then everything will be okay, or Flanders, or whoever it might be. I think we all we all need to take responsibility for this earth.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, what are your thoughts on the economy and prospects going forwards? I'll say a couple of things and then maybe circle back. But I guess the question is the global economy and also the fourth industrial revolution. On the macro economy, I think Fritjof's got some deeper comments probably to make, but I really don't think the problems of the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis 1.0 have been resolved at all. Debt has gone up since the last crisis. The IMF, you can read the Geneva report in 2014, which lay it out very clearly that the system's incredibly precarious and needs bailing out again. I think policymakers, or I know policymakers behind the scenes are planning the new financial architecture post the next crash, which presumably will happen within 5 years. So to me, that seems still very precarious. I think ultimately the system will be probably bailed out by the IMF, but I could speak about that on different webinars. The more positive area I see is on the micro side. A wave of creativity, entrepreneurship around the world. When I visit countries around the world, I see hotbeds of entrepreneurs in places where they never used to be. And I see more purpose-driven companies, which Simon might want to speak to. On the fourth industrial revolution, I mean, it's incredible. You talk to people in Silicon Valley, and they use words like we're at a time of 10 Gutenberg moments. This convergence of all these amazing technologies from artificial intelligence, robots, drones, biotech. So as usual, there's a lot of euphoria in the Bay Area. But technology can answer a lot of problems, and they can also create problems. And we already have employment participation in many countries around the world at historical lows. What happens when we bring all these robots in? I don't know what your thoughts are, Fritjof, on the big picture.
Well, in my analysis, I begin with the fact that I mentioned early on, that the major problems of our time are all interrelated and interdependent. And I actually drew a map of this interrelatedness of the world's major problem, which I published in my textbook, The Systems View of Life. And when you try to go deeper and deeper and figure out what's underlying all these interrelated problems, it seems to me that the fundamental dilemma of our global crisis is the illusion that unlimited growth is possible on a finite planet. It should be obvious to anybody, but this irrational belief in perpetual economic growth is held today by virtually all economists and political leaders. As you know, economic and corporate growth are the driving forces of global capitalism, the dominant economic system today. And in this economic system, perpetual growth is pursued relentlessly by promoting excessive consumption, a throwaway economy that is energy and resource intensive. It generates waste and pollution, depletes the Earth's natural resources, and increases world poverty. And moreover, these problems are exacerbated by global climate change, caused by our energy-intensive and fossil fuel-based technologies. So what's the answer? Some people talk about no growth or negative growth, but you see, growth is a central characteristic of all life. All living organisms grow. But growth in nature is not linear, nor is it unlimited. While certain parts of organisms or ecosystems grow, others decline, releasing and recycling their components, which become resources for new growth. Now, this kind of balanced, of multifaceted growth is well known to biologists and ecologists. I have called it qualitative growth to contrast it with the concept of undifferentiated quantitative growth used by today's economists. And when you look at our economists today, you can say, in fact, most of what is called growth today is waste. They are, toxic products, products we don't really need, and so on, which are thrown away, which means that we have largely an economy of waste and destruction. Qualitative growth, by contrast, is growth that enhances the quality of life through generation and regeneration. Now, regarding the fourth industrial revolution, I find this term rather confusing because people don't quite agree about the third industrial revolution. So numbering these industrial revolutions can be a little confusing. I believe that Jeremy Rifkin coined this term, the third industrial revolution. And according to Rifkin, it combines internet technologies with decentralized renewable energies. And it seems that this is not acknowledged by the people who are now promoting the idea of a fourth industrial revolution. Certainly, robots, computer technology, internet technology, and so on will play important parts. But unless they are linked to the real world of agriculture, of human well-being, of ecological sustainability, they will not be the solution. They will rather exacerbate the problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a bit of inflation in these industrial revolutions. I know some people already talking about the fifth industrial revolution, and now. But before I ask you, Simon, I just want to jump in and say what you say, Fritjof, about growth in nature not being linear, and when things die, you said that they release and recycle their components,
right?
Which become resources for new growth. I mean, that's what capitalism was meant to be, and I would say in some senses we actually haven't experienced real capitalism in recent years. Companies are meant to go through death and decline, and the economy is meant to go through natural cycles. That there are many good economists out there, some of them dead, but some alive economists today that have these alternative views. Schumpeter spoke about creative destruction as well.
Yeah, let me also, Benjamin, let me mention a friend and colleague of mine in Norway. He is an economist called Jacobsen, Uwe Jacobsen, and he writes books about the cyclical economy and about ecological economics. So, these alternatives are there, but they have a hard time asserting themselves in the community of economists.
Mm. Well, there's a lot of good thinking out of Austria and Germany, but in terms of economics. But I think that's a discussion for another day. Simon, what's your view?
Yeah, it's interesting. Fritjof mentioned that he created this map to really outline the consistency of life. It's interesting because a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a conference, Rethink Business, in Sao Paulo, and I actually showed Fritjof's map, because for me, there's a bit of a fashion now in business to talk about exponential organizations. But there's confusion. Exponential does not mean non-linear, because in non-linear systems, you have feedback loops. And as Fritjof has said, there's almost, people now are almost talking about, no, well, we don't need growth. We want exponential growth. But there's quite a spectrum of opinions. And sometimes people who are very focused on innovation, they talk about the exponential growth of a startup, of a company, without any idea of the context and the connection of this company to the economy and the natural environment. And I think it was I had quite an impact, because I said to people, look, this is the systems view of life. This is a map of what it looks like. And it's not a logarithmic graph just going off the scale. And again, I think this notion of qualitative growth is missing in a lot of discussions around innovation in new business. I think this is a great contribution that Fritjof makes.
And in fact, Simon, you can say that, there are examples of exponential growth, you can call it successful exponential growth from the growth perspective. And these would be population growth on the Earth, and the growth of CO2 components in the atmosphere. Both of these have grown exponentially. The CO2 growth, the carbon in the atmosphere, Al Gore based his whole book and slide lecture on this exponential curve, and it leads to disaster. So exponential growth in nature is usually balanced by feedback loops, as you say. Occasionally, very rarely, it is not, and then there's a catastrophe.
Yeah, very, very good point. Very good point. Well, I mean, this is a huge topic, and I'm also interested in. There's this kind of degrowth movement, and I certainly have a lot of time for that way of thinking. But I also think, having two televisions is not necessarily better than having three televisions is not necessarily better than two in your home. This sort of excess consumption. But I think we need to. There's a lot of people around the world trying to redefine GDP, and I think that's worth following up on and pursuing. But anyway, in the interest of time, we're kind of going over. But I was going to ask both of you that some people talk about a kind of an awakening of consciousness, a shift in a perspective that's occurring today, like the 1960s and 70s. So are people seeing the world in a different way today? Do you sense any shift, Fritjof?
Yes, I think absolutely. There is a new understanding of life that is now emerging, both in science and in communities around the world. And basically it amounts to a change of paradigms, as I said already, from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. You can also say this is a very profound change of metaphors, from the world as machine to the world as network. In fact, we're talking, or we should be talking, about networks within networks. We have biological networks, ecological networks, and social networks. Wherever we see life, we see networks. Now, a network, as everybody knows, is a particular pattern of links, of relationships. And so to understand networks, we need to learn how to think in terms of relationships, of patterns, in terms of context. And this is what systems thinking is all about. And one of my great sources of optimism is that our young people who are now 30, like my daughter is, have spent the last 10 or 15 years growing up in a networked world. They have their social media, they have their various online communities. They think in terms of networks. So they are natural systemic thinkers. And that's true all around the world. Let me just give you a simple example. When we, you two and I, meet, then we say, let's meet at a certain day, a certain time, and a certain place. And we go there and we meet. Now, my daughter's generation doesn't do that at all. They say, maybe let's go out tonight. And then they text each other, say at 6 o'clock, where are you? Then again at 7 o'clock, then again at 7:30. And so if there are 3 or 4 people involved, they slowly converge at a particular time, at a particular place. But this is not a predetermined time nor a predetermined place. This is thinking in a networked world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, the question is quite huge. For some people, it might be a bit esoteric, but I would say if you're not comfortable with the word consciousness, I think it's, as Fritjof said, it's a different way of experiencing the world, experiencing reality. I also, just to add to that, I think that I'm encouraged that there is now a much greater desire for meaning and purpose out there, anecdotally and even in data that I see, and I think it's like this crisis opportunity thing that you said, Simon. I think particularly since the last financial crisis in 08-09, a lot of people and companies have embraced meditation, yoga. They started talking more and more about purpose. I found one fascinating anecdote and data point in that people are taking time out from their lives and walking the pilgrimage trails more and more, like the Camino de Santiago across France and Spain, and old routes are being opened. In South Korea, where I am at the moment, they've opened up routes, Jeju Island off the coast of South Korea. The walking trail there has become the most popular tourist destination in the country. And of course, I think, you know, the shift in the sciences is helping this different way of seeing the world. What are you experiencing, Simon?
Well, again, I'll give a kind of British perspective on Brazil. Fritjof, you mentioned, you know, social networks and relating. Of course, Brazil is a very large country of really quite great economic inequality. But what's really interesting is the way in which the more economic disadvantaged people are really using social networks and also applications such as WhatsApp to, you know, democratize news and democratize education. This weekend, I know that we have quite a lot of Brazilians listening today. Quite a few of them were at the protests. There were some big protests all around Brazil on Sunday, and these were not people from the left or from the right. These were people from every single political persuasion wearing yellow and green, the colors of Brazil, to say it's not about politics anymore. We do not want corruption. So in terms of this change of consciousness, that was a real physical, a real explicit sense of demonstrating together and coming together as one to express the shared values. And also in terms of the younger generation, I won't go into this story in depth, but it is a bit below the radar outside of Brazil. But a lot of young people, teenagers, they've been involved in a very long protest about education The young people here, they're not rioting, they're not destroying things or stealing things. They're really occupying schools that have a severe lack of resources due to corruption. And so there's a lot of self-organizing here, of self-organized networks of young people saying the politicians are not doing their job. We absolutely demand a good quality education for ourselves. And again, this is a story that maybe could receive more visibility outside of Brazil. But it's fantastic to see these kind of expressions.
Yeah, well, we could have a whole call dedicated to this topic. We're trying to bite off a lot today. I guess the last question really kind of gives you an opportunity to kind of bring the threads together. But many futurists like myself describe the world as this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I guess the question is, what kind of leadership do we need now? And are there signs of it materializing? So Simon, you're there in the consulting world.
In the trenches.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should say that. I'm not going to, reveal the company, but in fact, I was actually in a company yesterday talking about VUCA and leadership. And we spent a long time looking at the dynamic way of seeing, understanding wholeness. So kind of to end where we started, it's really interesting because someone asked me, what exactly is the most difficult part of VUCA that leaders really need to pay attention to? And for me, it comes back to this notion that to really understand systems, it's a change of paradigm, and it's understanding ambiguity. So we have to introduce values into organizations in order that organizations can have authentic dialogues with leaders who are really able to absorb multiple perspectives from multiple people with, maybe semi-conflicting points of view. And again, a key word I really emphasized was we need extreme ownership. Leaders now really need to own the problems that are happening and really say, we have responsibilities for the lives of everyone in our organization and everyone that our organization impacts on. So yeah, absolutely. It's really about developing strong dialogue skills that come from a systems point of view and where leaders are really operating from authentic values and with the humility to really say their world perspective may be a bit limited. What am I not seeing? How can other people help to really achieve a more communal vision of what's happening and where we need to go?
Yeah, Simon, I completely agree with you. As I was collecting my thoughts and listening to you, you practically said what I was going to say, so I will just echo it in slightly different words. My feeling is in this world today, we do urgently need a new kind of leadership, and these new leaders need to have two principal qualities, which you both mentioned, both of them. First, they need to be capable of thinking systemically, of understanding the interconnectedness of our global problems and recognizing the already existing systemic solutions. And that would be a whole other conversation we could have. What are the existing systemic solutions? And secondly, the new leaders need to have a sense of ethics, a moral compass, in the memorable phrase of Václav Havel. So let me just add a couple of words about ethics. What is ethics? It is always related to a particular community. Ethics is behavior for the common good. And today, most of us belong to many different communities, but we all share two communities to which we belong. We all belong to humanity, and we belong to oikos, which is the Greek word from which ecology is derived, and it means household. We all belong to the earth household. And this means that two central ethical principles need to be human dignity, because we belong to the human community, and ecological sustainability, behaving like the other members of the earth household behave. And these are the qualities, I think, that the new leaders need to have.
Yeah, I guess I can only echo what you both said. I asked a friend of mine a year ago who retired from Silicon Valley. He was quite successful there, and had left some years ago, but he'd worked with Steve Jobs and all sorts of leaders. And I said, who was the most the one he admired? And he said that Chambers at Cisco, because he realized he looked at the world in a very systemic way, and saw that the company was operating in an open system, like a natural ecosystem, and he was always interacting with people outside his own organization. But when it comes to ethics, I look at it from the perspective, a slightly Eastern perspective, given how long I've kind of spent time out here. So my, well, I'm sure Fritjof will kind of resonate with that. And I think that the failure of the financial crisis and everything was a failure of wisdom. And I don't know how I exactly define wisdom, but to me, it's a sort of an ability to spontaneously apply the right response in a given situation. That there's a fluidity to it. It's not so much a list of right and wrongs, and it requires a leader to be grounded, to have humility, strength, and clear-mindedness. So I think it's a time where we have to work on ourselves. I think that was the final phrase of E.F. Schumacher's book. Was we have to start with ourselves. I think was literally his last paragraph. But I also think leaders need to be more like gardeners, perhaps now, rather than we're moving away from command and control. I think that new leaders need to harness the collective intelligence of their organizations and import self-organizing systems, like as we see in nature, the way the beehives operate, and you see the murmurations of starlings and things. I think by you adopting more self-organizing systems, we align ourselves with the creative force of nature. I believe you talk about a lot of these things in your Capra course, Fritjof.
That's right. Is this the time to do my commercial now?
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was what I was going to end on. Was like, if people want to, we're trying to cover way too much ground in just over an hour. But if people want to follow your work, learn more, what do they need to do?
Well, I've written a number of books, as you know, but I have two main resources for people. One is my recent textbook, The Systems View of Life, which I actually co-wrote with a good friend and colleague, Pierluigi Luisi, a biologist in Rome, and which was published by Cambridge University Press. It's now out in paperback. And based on this textbook, I put together a course, which is called Capra course for easy remembrance. And it is a course, an online course of 12 pre-recorded lectures offered at the rate of one a week. And there is a discussion forum. In the current course, we have people from over 30 countries and very lively discussions, daily discussions in this forum. And I should say that Simon has worked with me for several months now building up this course. and is participating in these discussions. You can also see a trailer when you go to the course website. Just look for Capra course on the internet. capracourse.net is the actual website address. And the next course will start in the spring of next year on the 1st of March 2017. And I hope that many in our audience will consider taking the course, and I look forward to more stimulating discussions.
Thanks. Yeah, I highly recommend it. I've been monitoring it myself. So Simon, what about yourself? How do people follow you?
I have a blog with many articles. My blog is transitionconsciousness.org, and also I'm the co-author with my wife Maria of our book Holonomics: Business Where People and Planet Matter. Maria does an awful lot of work in Brazil regarding values in organizations, and so we've brought together her work on values with Henry Bortoft's philosophy of wholeness. So, and of course, we also very much talk about the vicissitude of life in it. And also, it's been absolutely fantastic, sharing the conversations on Capra course, especially as we get towards the second half of the course, where people ask, well, how do we really put this into practice? We've had some great conversations on, systemic practices, what really works, how to introduce change programs into organizations. So I've absolutely loved Capra course, and I think it's quite amazing just how much time people get to share with Fritjof, asking all their questions. It's a very rich way for people to have some very deep and wonderful conversations.
And I should add to that that for me this is the first time that I'm teaching a course online, and these discussions are extremely rewarding, and I find them much more substantial than discussions in a classroom. The reason is simply that to ask a question, the participants don't need to think about something right away and ask it in the lecture. They can take their time. They can mull over it for a couple of hours. And for me, it's the same. To answer a question, I can go to my library, I can have a discussion with friends, I can go on the internet and really formulate a very substantial answer with links to videos, links to the literature, and so on. So these discussions are really substantial.
Yeah,
that's very encouraging. Well, from Emerging Future Institute, we launched the version 2.0 of our site just a month and a half ago. So content will sort of ramp up in the coming weeks and months. I hope I can persuade Simon and Fritjof to come back, and today was a bit of an experiment. I hope I can persuade them to come back and have a dialogue at some point. And please sign up for the free updates. You'll hear about our upcoming webinars. I think in the next couple of weeks we're going to have the author of Disruption Revolution, David, who's joining our advisory board, and he's just released a new book called Empower. The subtitle is Co-Creating the Future. We've got a science fiction writer joining us. We have an expert on organizations and co-creation, and I'm sure we'll have some economists. And oh yes, and first thing next year, myself and a geopolitical expert will be discussing the ramification of the Trump presidency. So a lot going on here, but I do encourage you to look at Simon's and Fritjof's work. I've put their books actually on our bookstore as well, so you can always go through there. So thank you so much for joining us, Fritjof and Simon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah. thank you, Benjamin, for hosting, and thank you, Fritjof. It's always incredibly stimulating talking with you. I'm sure we could have spoken for another hour or so at least. But and also I hope the people listening have enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you for joining us.